Good afternoon. Good to see you all. Glad to be part of this wonderful teach-in. Santosh Venkatesh, from whose mind this thing uh, emerged, fully formed and armed, is here too. So thank you, Santosh, for the invitation to do this panel on the future of the past. I'm here with my colleagues, all of us from the Classical Studies Department. We represent a mix of different fields of knowledge of the past, some literary approach, historical approach, philosophical, and archaeological are all going to be represented here. And we're delighted to have some time to talk about cutting edge knowledge, this time of things more than 2,000 or more years old. We live in a time, I think, in which we're wowed by our own expansion of knowledge, and that's an important thing to be. We should probably take a minute to pat ourselves on the back about how much it is that we know. But it's also the case that there's plenty of things that we still don't know, and that our orientation toward that whole world of potential knowledge is not so different from the orientation of the ancients toward the whole world of potential knowledge. We probably have a little bit wider background, but compared to what we don't know, what we know is still tiny. So I'm looking forward to having some conversation here with you all and with my colleagues on the number of interesting and different ways that knowledge both about the past and knowledge in the past has connections with what's happening in our contemporary world. Start off by introducing my colleague Brian Rose, who's here to speak on Are We Rome? Ancient and Contemporary Approaches to the Commemoration of War and Triumph. Brian?
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Peter. I will go through a lot of different topics in the course of a 15-minute presentation and start by saying, really, there's never been a more exciting time to be either a classicist or an archaeologist, because the distance between antiquity and the modern period has essentially collapsed to a point where, especially in the last 15 years, audiences have begun asking whether or not the US is analogous to Rome. And you see that in the cover slide here. Cullen Murphy's Are We Rome? Is there any difference, he asked, between what the Roman Empire was doing and what America has done in the wars in the last 15 years? And this has given rise to a number of responses, one of which, appropriately enough, is called Why America is Not a New Rome, written by Vaclav Smil, immediately following Cullen Murphy's publication. And as one looks at the kinds of images that are being juxtaposed today, one sees in a nutshell how the extent to which the distance between antiquity and the modern period has collapsed. So, for example, it's no longer uncommon to see images from the triumphal arch of Septimius Severus in Rome, dating to the early 3rd century, showing Roman soldiers parading Parthian prisoners from what is now Iraq and Iran through the streets of Rome in triumphal procession. This juxtaposed with the photographs from Abu Ghraib with prisoners on leashes from the same area as those who were the enemies of the Romans. And by the same token, one often sees images of this sort. The Column of Trajan to Rome, as many of you know, created in the early 2nd century AD, and chronicling the Roman war against the Dacians, the residents of ancient Romania. And one of the things that the Roman soldiers would do at the conclusion of a battle is to sever the heads of their enemies and present the severed head to the emperor as a war trophy, as you see here. These are the Roman soldiers, these are the severed heads of the Dacians, and they're presenting them to Trajan. And one often sees these kinds of images now juxtaposed with images from the Taliban and of ISIS, which indicate that the severed head, even after 2,000 years, is still a war trophy and still being displayed in the same way. As we look through the kinds of academic conferences that have occurred within the realm of archaeology since the beginning of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, it's a fundamental sea change from what had happened before. One sees these names repeated over and over again. Archaeology of war, archaeology of destruction, of conflict, of violence, of battle, of graves, of death. This has happened over and over again over the course of the last 15 years, and one sees it as well in the kind of literature that's been produced, which seeks to understand the modern period through the lens of antiquity. So conflict in ancient Greece and Rome, war as spectacle in the ancient and modern period, combat trauma and the ancient Greeks, comparing what happened in antiquity with what is happening now in terms of trauma, and then landscapes of violence across a diachronic perspective. By the same token, people try to understand or make sense of the conflict that is currently ongoing in the Near East and Central Asia by viewing it through the lens of ancient wars, especially the Trojan War. So it's not uncommon to see Achilles in Vietnam, Odysseus in America, or Ajax in Iraq. And I'm sure more such publications will come forward as time goes on. As an extension to that, what we're seeing are spectacles wherein veterans of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and/or actors will read Greek tragedies, read from Greek tragedies as part of public spectacle, especially those focusing on the Trojan War as a way of understanding comparisons, similarities, links between the Trojan War and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, as well as Syria now. And you can see that here with Ajax contemplating suicide. And of course, suicide among the soldiers in Iraq and Afghanistan has been a persistent issue, a persistent problem. And Bridget Murnaghan will speak more about this later. The two of us are engaged in a program called Eternal Soldier that follows very much along the lines of what I've just been saying, trying to lessen the distance between antiquity and the modern period by using objects in the Penn Museum and Homer himself, or his epics, as a way of healing the scars of the veterans, those who have experienced trauma. Now, the use of antiquity in the 20th century is something well known to most of you. It's not uncommon throughout the 20th century for rulers in a host of countries, including the US, to reach back to ancient models, ancient types, as a way of proclaiming the glory of the empire or region that they now rule. One of the more egregious examples is the Ishtar Gate in Babylon, which you see reconstructed in the Berlin Museum dating to about 600 BC, which was reproduced in downtown Baghdad, and within it was inserted a colossal image of Saddam Hussein as a way of indicating that he was a second Nebuchadnezzar, the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar come back to life. So an ancient foundation for a modern regime. Also in terms of war memorials and memorials to loss and tragedy, we're seeing the dominance or the importance of ancient models reused in contemporary designs. If you look at the Vietnam War Memorial, what is the primary decoration of that memorial? It's the list of names, the casualty lists of those who have died in the war. If you look at modern, or the most recent memorial for the World Trade Center, is there figural sculpture? There isn't. What you have are sets of names, the casualties from that disaster. And you can take that back to the Soros, the burial mound at Marathon, at the conclusion of the Persian Wars, where around the perimeter of the mound, you would have had the casualty lists of those who had died in the battle. Again, the same sort of iconographic configuration then as we've seen reproduced in so many modern war memorials. And we see that also in terms of memorials to tragedy. All of you, I think, are familiar with the design of the Oklahoma City Memorial, which commemorates those who were killed in the domestic terrorism incident wherein hundreds of people were killed in the blast in a federal building in Oklahoma City. For this, one thinks back to the ancient prototypes that probably the designer was thinking of as he put the new design together. In ancient mystery cults, as many of you know, the mystery of many of these ancient religious cults were that life would come from death. An agent in the cult would die and then come back to life. So rebirth or some sort of redemption. And as a way of indicating that the agent of the cult had died but would come back to life, an empty chair was used. You see it in the cult of Cybele, the great mother goddess in Asia Minor, whose cult was brought to Rome in the 3rd century BC. You see it in early Christian mosaics, this one from Ravenna. You see it with the empty chair in St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City. And it's this empty chair that has formed the basic component of the new war memorial. Again, when an archaeologist looks at these things, when I look at a modern war memorial, what I see are the ancient prototypes. Now, with some war memorials and some memorials to loss and tragedy, it's difficult to know how you can render the conflicting range of emotions that the event provokes. Can figural imagery convey it? If you take something like the Buddhas in Bamiyan, where this colossal Buddha and another one, this one 170 feet high, 53 meters high, was dynamited by the Taliban in 2001 so that only this empty shell survives. You can see the shadow of the original feature of the Buddha. How do you commemorate the savage iconoclasm of something like this? There have been suggestions of building the Buddha back up again, but in general, the people of Bamiyan have decided that the empty shell, the absence, is more of a presence than any monument could provide as an indication of the savagery of iconoclasm. Sometimes when we think of war memorials within the last 60 years, we're hard put to find or to think ourselves, if we were the designers, what words or image we would use to convey it. So something like the Kent State shootings in 1970, where 4 American college students were shot by members of the American National Guard. When you put that memorial together, you're the designer. What do you choose? What words or images could possibly convey, again, the range of emotions that this event provoked? In the end, George Siegel, the sculptor who was charged with designing the memorial, reached back to antiquity as a way of finding an answer, using a biblical motif, Abraham and Isaac, to commemorate the sacrifice. So a biblical model to commemorate the sense of loss that in his mind was analogous to that of father and son. And in the end, this was too controversial. The fact that he had filtered the emotions through antiquity remained too controversial for the monument to have been set up on the campus. And so it was refused and moved to Princeton University, which is where you can see it now. This is on the campus of Princeton. Now, with the World Trade Center, trying to find an effective way of commemorating, again, the range of emotions that you think of when you think of that attack. How are you going to do it? One of the ideas that was proposed by one of the designers was that the facade of the World Trade Center, the ruined World Trade Center, be preserved on the site where the centers had once stood, a ruined facade as a memorial to the act of barbarism that had brought down those buildings. And many had said, we'll do just what the Greeks did when they left the first Parthenon in ruins on the Acropolis for 30 years as a way of commemorating the barbarity of the Persians who had sacked their city during the Persian Wars. And of course, ruined facades are common war memorials. You see it in Coventry Cathedral, the Memory Church in downtown Berlin, the Gedächtniskirche, the buildings of Hiroshima in Japan, all using ruined facades. In the end, of course, they opted for names rather than ruined buildings. But what they did was to gather together pieces of the World Trade Center in a warehouse, and then they distributed each of those pieces to different cities across the nation, each of which wanted to build a memorial to this act of terrorism that brought down the World Trade Centers. And this ties in to the issue of power. How do you measure ultimate power or the highest level of power? Some would argue that power can be measured in a case where you have an object with a high level of power and you divide it up, you cut it up into 10 or 50 or 100 pieces, and each of those pieces will have the same level of power as the original object. So saints' relics functioned that way in the Middle Ages. And to an extent, we've got the same phenomenon in operation here. One could even say that these pieces of the World Trade Center are 21st century relics for us. Now, as I said, to an extent, there's never been a more exciting time to be a teacher or to be an archaeologist because of this collapsing period of time between antiquity and the modern period. And I just wanted to end by saying we've brought this to as many diverse audiences as we can. the role of the past in the present. I referred to one such program with veterans Reed Homer, about which Bridget will say more in a minute. But we've also reached out to the Army to try to teach them about antiquity, about archaeology, about the importance of preserving the past for the future, because they are now our legs. They guard the areas to which we can no longer go. This was done during World War II with the monuments officers, where academics and the military worked very closely hand in hand. That fell apart in the late 60s during the Vietnam War, where academics and the military at best disliked each other, and at worst, of course, hated and mistrusted each other. And so we had to put that back together again, but this is something that we've done. Soldiers come to the Penn Museum and use material from Iraq in our own collection as a way of understanding the past and their role in preserving it in the present for the future. Thank you.
Our plan is that we after each talk, we take a few questions from the audience. So any questions for Professor Rose?
I will say that the one thing, let me just show my final slide. This is why we're all here. This was the entrance to the Kabul Archaeological Museum in 2001. A nation stays alive when its culture stays alive. And that, I think, very much is the theme of this program and also of the University of Pennsylvania in a very real sense. So any questions? I've obviously taken you through some very unusual territory. Okay, perhaps in the wake of another talk.
Okay, very good. I'll also just mention Professor Rose needs to catch a flight, assuming it goes, and we'll have to leave the panel just a little bit early today. Our next speaker is myself, and I will be sharing with you some thoughts on ancient thinking about thinking, what we can learn from ancient philosophers about intuition. My name's Peter Struck, and I'm also with the Classical Studies Department, along with my colleagues here. I wanted to share with you some recollections that I have reaching into the past, going all the way back to 2009. I spent a year that year at a think tank at Stanford called the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences. We had a weekly seminar with this group. It was kind of a typical arrangement of faculty on sabbatical. A weekly seminar at which individuals would share their work and what they were doing. One afternoon it came to my turn to present to my peers what my research was. This is a group of people that study human behavior, cognitive scientists, evolutionary biologists, behavioral psychologists. The trick was that I study human behavior, but I study behavior that's 2,700 years old. I work on ancient Greece and Rome, and in particular I work on, and as if that's not arcane enough, I work on a particular corner of this arcane world that is itself arcane, even by its own standards, of ancient divination. I'm interested in particular in the ancient practice in which it was assumed that hidden signs were buried in the world around us, and that it was up to ourselves to go around, spot these hidden signs, and use them as useful information. Those that were really attuned to this vocabulary could use the information buried in these signs to adjust their own behavior and use it to their advantage. And this could be knowledge about the present and about the future. It could be knowledge about the future, yes, but it could also be hidden knowledge about the present or even knowledge about the past. If a particular god was angry, you might use a practice of divination to figure out what happened in the past to make that god angry. The traditional idea, and one that I think probably still is present in our way of studying, is that these signs come from the gods. But there's lots of disagreement in antiquity about where these signs come from. Some do think that it's a kind of personal act of communication, like a person-to-person call from a god to an individual. But there are many different views on this, and the philosophical views are a little bit more complicated, and it's those that I'm going to dig into in a little bit in a minute. But first, a few words about the practice itself. So just about anything in antiquity could be thought of as a potential sign. We have oracles set up at large shrines built in the middle of cities, or more often in faraway places just a day's walk away from cities. We also have techniques of reading omens that would happen on a battlefield, so there might be something strange that occurred, a bolt of lightning, or a particular flight path of a bird, that might be thought to be a sign. Reading of the entrails of sacrificed animals was a common thing that was done. So the gods, they thought, liked to have live animals sacrificed to them. And when that sacrifice happened, the entrails were a spot where they examined to see what the divine will was all about. Lightning, wind, rustling of leaves, really nearly anything that moved in antiquity could have been thought of as a divine sign. And at each point, at each corner in ancient history, you look, there are people that are particularly attuned to these things, to whom people turn to try to figure out what the divine vibe of the time is. In a way, it's like turning to these people as if a person would turn to a weatherman or weatherman to try to figure out what's the kind of prevailing wind, what's happening out there in the atmosphere, to see whether this particular action that I want to contemplate is a good thing to do. This sounds like a exotic and sort of narrow behavior, and yet it was as widely practiced as any other religious behavior in antiquity. And I mean that not just for Greeks and Romans, but across the whole old world, from the tips of northern Britannia all the way down to the southern tip of Africa, and from east to west Eurasia. Ancient peoples were in the habit of doing this. The techniques varied a little bit, but everyone would have thought that there were signs about the future or hidden recesses of the present or the past buried into the present time. Now, classicists, when they've treated this phenomena, have tended to treat it in one of two bins. Either it's looked at as a kind of occult practice, so it belongs to a group of superstitions that we do see in the ancient world that have very little purchase on our way of thinking now. It's a kind of superstition that we've sort of grown out of, and it doesn't have much to do with the contemporary world. That's one way that it's looked at. And there is actually a whole thriving part of ancient study among classicists today that looks at ancient superstitions and the roles that they played in their societies. Another way of looking at it is a quite different one that looks at its important role in social history, which divination surely had. Delphi, the Oracle of Delphi, many will know, had a role in authorizing wars and in authorizing the expansion of a nation beyond its borders, or city beyond its borders, into other places. So it had a kind of role, something, yes, like a religious temple, but also kind of like the Hague or something. It was an international place to which people could bring problems of international importance. So divination did have a role in social history, and those that studied in that dimension also have another sort of thriving way of looking at divination. Both of these, I think, are important, but they fall short a little bit for me of exactly what I was interested in. The problem is that each of them, though different in their own way, the occult version of what divination is and the social practice version, each of them thinks that what's happening in divination is basically senseless. It just simply doesn't make sense. That senselessness is filled in with the social historians by saying this is a way that social capital was maneuvered around, so it's a way that the elites might have tricked the lower classes into thinking that God was on their side. Or on the occult side, they don't feel a need to fill in that irrationality, just saying ancient minds were prey to irrationality. But neither of these is all that satisfying, I think, of a way of thinking about divination as a practice. It just doesn't make all that much sense for two reasons. Number one, if divination was mainly about politics, which social historians are telling us, then it makes no sense that individuals would have consistently used divination in matters of intimate personal concern. Matters where stakes that had something to do with manipulating masses or using this for sort of social ways of manipulating people, these are not at stake. You just want to know something that has to do with your own self personally, whether you should enter into a business deal with someone, whether you should marry this person, whether you should go on a trip at a certain time. These were places where diviners were thought to have some help, some purchase and help for us. Then also the claim that divination is an occult practice that doesn't make sense runs into another problem, and this is where I particularly jump in. Divination is, yes, thought of by some in antiquity, a very few, as being potentially an area of superstition, but almost everybody thought it worked. and by almost everybody, 99.9%. And that includes also the hard-nosed philosophers of the day: Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, the Neoplatonists. All the major philosophical schools in antiquity thought there was something to it. I took that as a potential avenue of research to see, well, if they thought there was something to it, let me try to figure out what they thought there was to it. Digging into these ancient philosophers led me down a different path. And to help understand what this is, I want to flash back for a second to my time at Stanford. So as I listened to my colleagues doing their presentations at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, they were presenting case studies and different areas of investigation into a phenomenon that a layperson might call intuition. There are numbers of ways in which our rationality works. I think all of us probably understand, but let's just call it a kind of common paradigm understanding of how rationality works. That is, we self-consciously have some problem that we're interested in. We direct ourselves to gather a bunch of evidence, as much as we can, that's pertinent to the problem. We use our tools of rationality to draw inferences from our problems toward a conclusion that then we use to direct our action in the future. The thing is, according to our colleagues and the cognitive scientists and behavioral scientists that I was exposed to at the Center for Advanced Studies in Behavioral Sciences, this accounts for a small fraction of the behaviors that we engage in any given day. There are huge pieces of our lives that we organize according to different modes of rationality, some of which, of course, there'll be plenty of what we do that answers to this kind of standard paradigm of rationality. But there's a lot of what we do that is involved in processing information in non-conscious ways. So we're consistently gathering information from the world around us in ways that, yes, sometimes we're self-aware of, but in many times when we're not self-aware, we use that information according to our own internal cognitive processes of which we're not aware to organize a general understanding of the world that leads us to have certain kinds of predispositions that are very important cognitively in how we organize our world. So our minds have a tip of rationality, but there's an iceberg underneath the water of non-conscious behaviors that are irrationality that's constantly going. It's the kind of thing, as I say, a layman such as myself in the world of cognitive science would call intuition. Some of the scientists in this world are fine to adopt that term, some don't. They think it's too sort of mystifying. But the question of how we non-consciously process information was of great importance. And not least, it was interesting to see among this group people like Nalini Ambady, Nicholas Epley, and some others, names I had already seen made famous by Malcolm Gladwell in his work, like Blink and these other, in the thinking without thinking is Gladwell's big thing, and he was making famous the work of these cognitive scientists. So at this point I'm exposed to this and I'm thinking about my material in a slightly different way. What if what they're doing in antiquity is thinking without thinking in these divinatory contexts? It started to help shape my study of the philosophical accounts and cast a new light on them. What if what we have here in the processes of divination is not so much superstition as a cultural way of organizing this whole phenomena of thinking without thinking? Looking back on my philosophers, it gave me new light on their attempts to try to explain divination. As I said, they were not looking at it in these traditional ways that the locals had sort of developed to try to explain what was happening, one person-to-person calls from gods. Instead, they looked at it as a situation in which it was hard to come up with theories, but it seemed like, they said, Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics, and the others, some people are just really good at coming up with solutions to very complex problems in the heat of the moment, on the spot, and they make good calls. Some people have better gut judgments than others. And that's the classification of divinatory thinking that they were most interested in. So working through their materials, I started to propose a different way of trying to understand what was happening in ancient divination. And it started from my proposal of what was a central axiom of the research project I was working on at the time. And my central axiom is that our ability to know exceeds our capacity to understand that ability. I'll just repeat that. Our ability to know exceeds our capacity to understand that ability. So to a certain extent, and let's just say for now irreducible, our cognitive selves will be to some degree mysterious to us. This mysterious part results in knowledge over which we don't have full control and over which we can't quite claim how we got it. And nevertheless, sometimes it turns out that what we've got in these non-conscious ways turns out to be right. So it's my proposition in this, after working with these cognitive sciences, that this exists, this axiom obtains for humans in antiquity as well as today. If it's really an axiom, it should have been just as true in antiquity as it is now. And this surplus knowledge, the result of extra knowledge that comes to you and you're not conscious of how you got it, this surplus knowledge is provocative. And it provokes us to try to explain it. Where in the world did this come from? Today, I think we work with a pretty thin category of intuition. That's a polite way of talking about this phenomenon. When you come up with something you're not sure how you knew it, you'll use intuition to describe it in polite company. And people may say, well, you probably shouldn't reinvest your 401k based on that, but maybe there's something to it. Like, yeah, and interestingly, in situations of maximal concern, sometimes intuition is the most important deciding factor. Should I marry this woman or that guy? Guy A or guy B, or woman A or woman B? Use your rational mind as best you can, and good luck with it, right? Something else is going to overtake that process. Buying a house, buying a car, these really huge and big and important and consequential decisions, oftentimes, I think we would all accept, probably, are due to things other than that process A that I was describing below, or above, as the kind of way that our cognitive cells we think works. So in looking at this, I started to think about divination entirely differently. I started to think about it as analogous not to contemporary practices of tarot cards and fortune tellers. All of these things exist, and they're sort of fun as things you do, usually late at night after several cocktails. You might go ahead and go visit one of them, but they're socially marginal. They're just something you indulge in a way that you don't necessarily expect to be important or regular. Divination was never socially marginal. It was built into the system of their world, and I think it makes most sense to think of it as something less exotic than tarot cards or fortune tellers in the contemporary world. It looks much more in antiquity like something you and I would call intuition in contemporary world. So I started to look at divination instead of an occult practice or a means of social manipulation as a large and robust cultural structure built up to try to acculturate this strange phenomena of surplus knowledge. And by acculturate it, I mean to make it useful, to explain it, to harness it, to keep people from making overbroad claims on it, and to help use it within its cultural position. So that's my presentation, and if you've got questions, look forward to answering them. Yes?
Thank you very much. Very interesting, but you seem to be avoiding the word unconscious. Why? I mean, that seems to me a much more, there's a whole history of that concept and so forth for this kind of knowledge, it seems like.
Yeah, and in fact, the Freudian resonance of that term is important, and as Freud is building his own system, he will make reference to this ancient material. Freud is fascinating. Freud is a wonderful, and I think it's mostly Freud that you have in mind, is that potentially right? Or Freud is, if you haven't read him in a while, he has this incredibly bossy way of presenting his ideas, right? He will talk about, the ancients had such ideas. He talks particularly about Artemidorus' book on dreams, which is another slice of ancient divinatory literature. And he'll say, yes, those ancients, they had a dim adumbration of the truth I, Freud, myself, have discovered in their own material. So he would say that it would be completely irrelevant. But no, I don't mean to necessarily avoid that term. I want to, in using non-conscious, which is the term I most often use, what I want to talk about there is a set of cognitive activities and behaviors that are happening over which we're not consciously directing, that nevertheless result in the kinds in determining behaviors that we engage in. And the separation from Freud is just what I want to do with avoiding the term unconscious in this context. But with more conversation, I think we could usefully, link up the kinds of things I'm talking about with the kinds of things that Freud's talking about. And in terms of the history of these ideas, he's a critical juncture in the time in this that leads, I think, to a contemporary appreciation of the number of unconscious or non-conscious ways in which our cognitive cells are constantly operating. So, yes?
Would it be fair to say that the ways of accessing intuition in antiquity were pretty mechanistic. I mean, they weren't all that different than tarot cards and fortune telling.
Mhm.
Uh,
I've got, well, and let me make sure I'm on the right path. So the idea that there would be, say, a particular kind of ritual that would be conducted, and then that outcome would somehow be mechanistically linked to what the future is supposed to be. Yes, I think that's fair enough to propose. And the trick, though, is when you start digging into these systems of divinatory of attempts to discern the hidden sign using divinatory techniques, they present themselves as if they're just scientific to result in a particular result, but the techniques themselves are utterly inscrutable, such that the endpoint sign, for example, an entrail, if it's pink or if its coloration is off or if the gates of the entrail are a little floppy, then, well, they would say, according to the science, that would lead to a particular outcome. But the reading of that entrail is not hardly scientific, and there are no manuals that survive from antiquity in any of these important areas of divinatory phenomena, except for astrology and dreams, but there's more to talk about there. There's no manuals that survive that tell us exactly what this result is supposed to mean for the future. What you do is you harness these intuitive type minds to sit down and stare at that mush in there and say, oh, look, this is a sign of X. The phenomena that they're reading is not usually reducible to any kind of schema. And it's apparent in the handbooks that purport to give you the rules on which these things are based. They're all extremely mushy. It doesn't give you a science of how to make this happen. So I think what you've got is a whole bunch of practices that are set up basically to resist formulation according to the rules of scientific inference in order to allow that intuitive mind to take over and make a different kind of reading than you get from straightforward inference according to rules. Thank you. Maybe one more question and then we'll go on. Yes?
So if logic is a way of knowing that relies on sort of a more conscious reasoning, then if you consider belief as another way of knowing, is there really any distinction between intuition as a way of knowing and belief? Knowing that belief is something that a group develops, whereas intuition is more of a...
I think it would, of course, depend on your definitions of each. But yes, there would be a distinction in these ancient philosophical accounts between these questions of belief and the kinds of non-conscious knowing that you have. They each have their own very robust epistemological schemes. They're very interested in how we gain knowledge, all the ancient philosophers, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and beyond. So they've got very scrupulous sets of categories into which they'll put bins of knowledge. Belief is usually on the very, very low end, rationality at the top end. In the middle is where things like what I'm calling the intuitive knowledge that results from divination, they would reside in the middle between these. None of the philosophers I look at instantly embrace and say, oh, we should go and talk to diviners about what the good is, or what truth itself is, or what the universe is all about. They don't say that. They just basically think there's some kind of intuitive incremental knowledge we might get from these people. At the same time, when they're classifying belief, it's the kind of thing a person does without any kind of cognitive backing at all, and it's usually something that they downplay very much in terms of its epistemological significance, which makes, in the history of ideas, belief has a different kind of resonance in a post-Christian, particularly in a post-Christian world. Pistis, for Paul, becomes a completely different thing, but it's not so for the ancient philosophers. I think we should probably move on, but we'll be happy to have time remaining at the end, conversation for all of us. So hold any questions, the rest of the questions till the end, please. Next, I'll introduce my colleague Jeremy McInerney, who's going to speak to us on red state, blue state, Athenian state, United States, comparing democracies, ancient and modern. Jeremy McInerney.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. I'm a Mac person rather than a PC, so just give me a moment while I see whether I can open this without making it all blow up. Look at that, mirable. Is that right?
Good.
Good. You hummed. I thought there was...
Oh, I thought it was the top. Are we only seeing the bottom?
No.
Oh, okay.
I designed it weirdly.
Oh, sorry.
Peter's presentation reminded me that in Malcolm Gladwell's book, he tells a story that comes from our world of the classics. The Getty purchased some years ago a very expensive kouros, a life-size male nude statue. They paid $6 million for it, and then they brought in a team of experts to verify its authenticity. I would have brought the experts in first and then spent the money, but I spend my millions differently from the Getty, clearly. One of the people they brought in was Eve Harrison, who some of you guys will know, who knew more about Greek sculpture than any living person. And they stood her in front of the kouros, which at that stage was draped. They wanted to get her initial reaction, the blink reaction. And they pulled the robe off, and apparently as she saw this, the first words out of her mouth were, "Oh dear." Intuition still really works, particularly as part of artistic knowledge. You'll notice that when Brian started, he showed you the cover of a book that said something like, Is America Rome? What you'll never see in a bookstore is a book that says, Is America the new Spain of Philip II? And you'll never see a book that says, America is not the China of the Tang Dynasty. My point is, there are other great civilizations, other great cultures, great empires, obviously, but we have something particularly at stake in the way we worry about our debt from antiquity and whether or not we can model ourselves on them or whether they're going to show us what will become of us. It's a very peculiar relationship built into our cultural DNA, and that's, in fact, what I want to really get at. It's a sort of an answer to the question, why should we study the Greeks? What are we getting from them? I can make it move upwards, good. The usual answer that people give, the one they start with, is democracy. And you've probably heard this since you were in primary school, that a teacher will point out to you that democracy is a Greek word that comes from demos, the people, and krateia, power. So if you have a system of government in which people have the power, you're a democracy. They're a democracy, we're we're just like the Greeks. But if you go one step beyond that, you'll... Can I?
Yes, but I have to plug. Are you going off the podium computer or your own?
No, the podium computer.
Yeah, then it's fine.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah.
If you go, thank you, Brian. If you go one step beyond this very facile argument based on etymology, what you'll get is frequently a reference to the fact that in the ancient democracy, women, slaves, and minors and foreigners were excluded. Can I be really tedious for a moment and make this interactive? Okay, would you please stand up if you are an American citizen? Really, would you please stand up if you're an American citizen? All right, that's just to give you a baseline for who here really is within the club. Now, to work out Athenian citizens, the Athenian democracy, would you sit down if you're a woman, please? And would you sit down, please, if you were born in another country? And now would you sit down, please, if you're under the age of 30? And would you sit down, please, if you have not done military service? Congratulations. Who knew? This happens every time. This happens every time. You can imagine when I'm teaching undergraduates, there's one poor senior auditor who's struggling to remain anonymous in the back of the room, and everyone sees him. So do you see, the Athenian democracy is actually not like our democracy in most respects at all. It's very different. It's also fully participatory. And if you've read The Federalist, you'll know, particularly in the 10th Federalist, the Founding Fathers were deeply concerned about the idea of a direct democracy. They modeled the American Constitution and the system of government on a Republican model because they wanted a layer to protect against mob rule, essentially. So if you asked an Athenian, who's your representative, he wouldn't know how to answer because he didn't have one. If you asked, who voted on the war with Philip or the war with Iraq? Well, here, nobody voted on the war with Iraq. You voted for a representative who may have cast a vote or not. But in Athens, any war was undertaken by a direct vote of the people. So there are real significant differences between our notion of democracy and their notion of democracy. They do have one wonderful institution, and that is of ostracism. Every year they would hold a vote, and the vote was simply, shall we expel someone? And if the answer was yes, if there was a majority, they came back a month later, and then they asked people to walk into the assembly holding bits of pottery, in Greek these are called ostraka, and to scratch the name on it of the person they wanted to expel. And if you got the majority of votes, you simply had to leave Athens for 10 years. Now, you weren't banished in the sense that your property was seized. You weren't excluded from Athens forever. You were just told, get out for 10 years, which is a great safety valve. If you've got someone who you don't like, I won't even go into it, but I know who many of you would like to expel right now. You'll have to wait until he's not re-elected. If we think about this relationship, this very particular one, and I often refer to this with undergraduates as a kind of cultural DNA, our connection to the Greeks, one of the reasons why we are so closely connected to them is because we are not simply a democracy, but we want to think about what the rights and privileges of a democracy are. And the Greeks supply us with the first statement that I know of in history that is an articulation of what we would call a democratic ideology. Pericles, in the funeral oration recorded by Thucydides, at the end of the first year of the Peloponnesian War, says, we have a form of government that does not emulate the practices of our neighbours, setting an example to some rather than imitating others. And his ideal vision is of one where individuals advance through merit. This is good Republican stuff, right? Public service is valued, kind of thing that makes people want to work in the FBI. Privacy of the individual is respected. It emphasizes equality before the law, isonomia, and even the Athenian taste for festivals and games and attractive surroundings are regarded as a plus because it means we know how to live a civilized, balanced life. We're not endlessly training for war like the Spartans. And so he says, we love beauty while practicing economy. You cannot read this speech without the hair standing up on the back of your neck. It really is quite glorious. And we love wisdom without being enervated. So this is the ideal citizen that the Athenians come up with in their reflections about themselves. A man ready to fight for his community, and yes, it is a man in every case. I understand the language is sexist, but I'm reflecting what they say. A man who appreciates the beautiful, a man who values learning as much as military skill. And Pericles links this to participation in the democracy, valuing debate, not as empty rhetoric, but as the lifeblood of real democracy. Now, this speech has had an astonishing afterlife in Western culture, and most particularly for the four of us at this end of the room, it's been vitally important because the Prussian Minister of Education, Wilhelm von Humboldt, riffing on this, founded the university system in Germany that made ancient history, philology, and classical studies, Altertumswissenschaft, the foundation of university education in modern Europe. And that Minister for Education said, in the Greeks we have before us a nation in whose fortunate hands everything which, according to our deepest feelings, sustains the noblest and richest aspects of human existence, matured to the utmost perfection. To know them is for us not just pleasant, advantageous, and indispensable. Only in them do we find the ideal of that which we ourselves should like to be and to produce. And you can see here the origins of a powerful current of Philhellenism, a notion that the Greeks provide a model for what we would like to be. And Brian, this is for you, since you're going to be lecturing there later today, I believe. This is the Parthenon down in Nashville, which I think pretty dramatically shows you the way in which we identify with that culture, and we want, in a sense, to make it our culture as well, to bring the two together. Our city is an education to Greece, but, and I didn't introduce this because I wanted there to be some shock value, Thucydides has Pericles at the end of the first year of the war give us this astonishing statement of how glorious it is to be an Athenian. And in the next chapter he says that was after that summer, that was when the plague hit Athens. And he goes on to describe in excruciating detail what happens to individual bodies and then what happens to the body politic as a result of it being hit by plague. Pericles himself dies a year after giving his glorious speech. And so we get Thucydides now showing us a modern scientific approach. He's writing like a Hippocratic doctor. People in good health were all of a sudden attacked by violent heats in the head and redness and inflammation in the eyes, the inward parts such as the throat or tongue becoming bloody and emitting an unnatural and fetid breath. These symptoms were followed by sneezing and hoarseness. I always hesitate reading this in front of hypochondriacs because you can see them starting to go like this as I'm reading it. When it fixed in the stomach, it upset it, and discharges of bile of every kind named by physicians ensued, accompanied by very great distress. In most cases, also, an ineffectual retching followed, producing violent spasms, and so it goes on. Now, as people die, there is a dilemma about what do we do with the dead bodies. And he goes on to describe how families would erect a funeral pyre, and then others would come along and rip that body off and stick one of their own dead relatives on top. People were trying to get a release from this thirst, and so they would go to wells, but they would die, and the bodies would be then infecting the well. So that you go from a literal contagion to a kind of contagion of the entire society as order begins to break down. I can't obviously give you any ancient illustrations of it, but this is Poussin's version of it with, horribly children still trying to suckle at the breast of a dead mother. The social dimensions of the plague go on. Some died in neglect, others in the midst of every attention. No exact remedy was found for what did good in one case, did harm in another. By far the most terrible feature of the malady was the dejection which ensued when anyone felt himself sickening, for the despair into which they instantly fell took away their power of resistance. And so you hear about this increasing mortality. On the one hand, if they were afraid to visit each other, they perished from neglect. Indeed, many houses were emptied of their inmates for want of a nurse. On the other, if they ventured to do so, death was a consequence. In other words, if you behave well and try to show human compassion for other humans, you die. And if you stay on your own, you'll probably die anyway. Now, the reason I raise this is because there is the quality of the Greeks that I adore is this open-eyed quality that says, we are balanced men, we are ready for war, but we love a good social life. We are everything integrated in the Athenian. And at the same time, they'll say, but we have killed our opponents, we've slaughtered our opposition, and the breakdown of society was really disgusting. Now open your eyes and let me show you what this looks like. They're very open-eyed about this. This is what I think we can pick up from in the Greeks. Because on the one hand, you could say we are the shining city on the hill, quoting John Winthrop's sermon, crops up in basically every second State of the Union address. But this is also, as we all know, America. This is not a third world country. This is New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. The Greeks would not hide from this. They would say that is as truly us as is the shining city on the hill. And it's that heritage of looking open-eyed at both what is good and what is vile in us and in our society that makes the Greeks a really worthwhile model. Mario Cuomo in 1984 said there's another part of the city, apart from the shining city on the hill, where some people can't pay their mortgages, most young people can't afford one, where students can't afford the education they need, and middle-class parents watch the dreams they hold for their children evaporate. And if the shining city on the hill could be in every state of the Union, this could be in every reply to the State of the Union, certainly in the time that I've lived in the States. We are deeply culturally DNA connected to the Greeks, whether we like it or not. And that's something that I think we should explore rather than take for granted. For example, what is this building? It's the Lincoln. I'm getting more and more horrified every year at how few people instantly say it's the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, second question, the more important one. What is that building? What's it doing? What's its function? What is it?
Memorial to Lincoln.
It's a memorial to Lincoln. Okay. If you were a Greek and you were looking at that, what would you say it is? It's a temple. And inside a temple, you'll have a larger-than-life-size statue of a god. Do you see, at a deep level, not just subliminal, but in fact actually being evoked iconographically, that's a Greek temple with a god inside it. And so in some way, the architect and the sculptor and the designers and the people who paid for it either knew, or if they didn't, they sure intuited in a very interesting fashion, that they were modeling Lincoln on a Greek god. So we're evoking the classical past. But what I want to suggest to you, and this is the only point I'm really making here is, for heaven's sakes, investigate that past, but do it critically, because you can learn a lot, not just about the Greeks, but about ourselves. For example, the building on the right is the Parthenon, okay? It's a building for a goddess. The building on the left, and I've used a Philadelphia example. I'm sorry? It's the Second National Bank. Yeah, William Strickland's Second National Bank, currently a picture gallery. So we've got the form, and we've carried it over because it means ye olde worldy and classical and high status. The function's totally different. So it's a complicated legacy we've got from the Greeks. And it can't be summed up, I think, any better than by this. Alfred North Whitehead famously remarked, the European philosophical tradition consists of a series of footnotes to Plato. And that is one of those wonderful apophthegms that is essentially saying, anything that you think may be interesting in modern philosophy is really dumb. All you've got to do is just read Plato, read Aristotle. It's all there. Except that, if you ask, what did Aristotle and Plato have to say about something like slavery, an absolutely universal and ubiquitous feature of the classical world, and a significant part of this nation's history, there is famously one passage in the Politics where Aristotle says, well, as to slavery, some people ask whether it's right or not, and the answer is pretty clear. It obviously is right. Why? Aristotle has a notion of teleology, that everything serves an end or a function. Every relationship does. So, if you have a horse, and it's a beautiful white horse, and it's running around, and it's untamed, and whatever, what use is it? What does it tell us? Well, the answer is, it doesn't have one at all. It's just a pretty thing. Whereas, if I tame it, I can use it to ride on, I can use it to take me to battle, I can deliver the post, whatever. It becomes functional. And Aristotle actually says that applies to all human relationships. So, if there is a young girl who, for example, is unmarried, what is her purpose, her function? Well, it's kind of useless. Whereas if she is tamed, that is to say married, she's given by her father to her husband, she now provides a uterus which can then give us a new generation of citizens. And that's useful. If I have a stick, what is its function? Nothing, it's a stick. But if I bend it with tension and put a string across, I now have a bow. And I can either make beautiful music or I can fire arrows. So everything exists in a relationship of tension, and therefore, he says, clearly in the case of humans, some people are designed to be masters and others are designed to be mastered. Therefore, the final proof that slavery is appropriate is that there are slaves, which would not get you through Logic 101, I hope. I'm going to finish with this. I've tried to give you a complicated view of both the Greeks and our legacy. But there is a part of this that I think is important, and that is that we've inherited also some very fine things from the Greeks, such as Churchill, we shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds. And he's evoking there clearly Demosthenes and the call to arms. Since the world began, no man has ever prevailed upon Athens to attach herself in the security of servitude to the oppressors of mankind, however formidable. In every generation she has striven without a pause in the perilous contention for primacy, for honour and for renown. The Athenians of that day did not search for a statesman or a commander who should help them to a servile security when Philip II was advancing on the city. They did not ask to live unless they could live as free men. My point is this. The Greeks are flawed, as are we. But it is a fine thing to have models to which you aspire, even if they are flawed. It's better than having no models at all. And so I'll give you finally then my last example, the defense of Thermopylae. I'm sorry for the formatting. Xerxes and the barbarians attacked, but Leonidas and the Greeks, knowing they were going to their deaths, advanced now much farther than before into the wider parts of the pass. Throughout the day before, they had sallied into the narrow way and fought there, guarding the defensive wall. Now, however, they joined battle outside the narrows, and many of the barbarians fell, for the leaders of the companies beat everyone with whips from behind, urging them forward. Many of them were pushed into the sea and drowned, far more were trampled alive by each other, with no regard for who perished. Since the Greeks knew they must die at the hands of those who had come round the mountain, they displayed the greatest strength they had against the barbarians, fighting recklessly and desperately. And you'll notice here that we've come back to it yet again, in this case by David's painting of Leonidas at Thermopylae. And I'll draw to your attention that not only is the heroic figure in the center here, riveting our attention, but up here is a man who is using the handle of his sword to engrave an epitaph to the Spartans there on the very rock at Thermopylae. And that epitaph was, Oxein angelein lakedamonios hotiteda kimitha tois kinon remasi pethomonoi. Stranger, go tell the Spartans, we lie here obedient to their words. The Greeks owned slaves, the Greeks were flawed, they were not perfect. But it's good to have ideals, it's good to aspire, and the Greeks are, I think, a people worth trying to emulate for their best and not their worst. Thank you.
A couple of questions, Frank?
I agree, it's a totally convincing argument.
Well, we can save time till the
Sure.
end, and we'll have a broader discussion. So at this point, I'll bring up our next speaker, Professor Sheila Moynihan of the Department of Classical Studies as well. She will be talking to us on ancient myths and modern lives, reading Homer with veterans.
Thank you. So what's going on with the computer? Oh, here we go. Okay. So,
Click the X.
I guess X out Jeremy's. Yeah, sorry. Okay, and then. Okay, so actually I want to start by showing you the cover of a book. So how do I, wait a minute, so how do I advance this?
You could use the arrow keys on the keyboard.
Okay, very good. Sorry. So I wanted to start by showing you this book cover. This is a translation into English of one of the earliest and greatest works of ancient literature, Homer's Odyssey, for which I wrote the introduction. Translations like this one are essential intermediaries between the world of scholarship and academic knowledge that's occupied by people like me and Jeremy and Peter and Brian, and a wider audience that also includes our students, many of whom read translations like this in the course of their time here at Penn, but also other interested readers. With its cover, I think it's clear that this book is sending a message that the Odyssey, even though it was first composed close to 3,000 years ago, is a work that speaks to our time. The fantastic journey into uncharted territory that the hero Odysseus takes in his effort to get home from the Trojan War is obviously in some way being equated with modern space exploration. The home that Odysseus hopes to reach is as distant and also as alluring as the Earth seen from the moon. But of course, the ability of the Odyssey to speak to our time through a book like this depends on a huge amount of specialized knowledge. The translator who produced this kind of inviting English text, Stanley Lombardo, had to be able to read and understand something that looked like this. And this pretty neatly organized and actually pretty legible text, pretty easy to read if you happen to know the Greek alphabet and the ancient Greek language, is not the form in which the Odyssey came down to us from the ancient world. It is itself the product of a lot of work by modern scholars who had to put it together on the basis of versions that survived in medieval manuscripts that might look like this. Those manuscripts were based in turn on ancient texts that might look like this. And this is a little bit of the Odyssey that dates to around 200 AD that's actually in the collection of the Penn Museum. Many, our most ancient texts of Homer are only in the form of little scraps like this one. In order to make sense of and appreciate this text, scholars have had to put together all kinds of information, beginning with the comments on the poem that were made by our ancient counterparts, ancient scholars who were already studying Homer and whose observation and bits of information that would otherwise be unavailable to us survives in some of those medieval manuscripts, like this one, where the text in the center is surrounded by a wealth of marginal notes. And these are the kinds of bits of information that scholars have to learn to read and interpret in order to benefit from the information that they contain. Other kinds of things that modern Homeric scholars try to understand would include the specialized dialect of ancient Greek in which the poem was originally composed, the historical circumstances out of which the legend of the Trojan War arose, and actually for that, archaeological investigations such as the one that my colleague Brian Rose actually undertook at the site of Troy, along with all the other things that he's done in his career. That kind of archaeological exploration is an extremely important source of information. People have to work to reconstruct the cultural context in which a set of stories that had developed over many centuries and were passed down through oral traditions were written down in a form in which we can still read them today. We have to try to understand the social organization, the values, and the religious beliefs of the distinctive warrior culture that a poem like the Odyssey describes. So when I wrote the introduction to this translation, in my effort to make the poem accessible to non-specialist readers, I needed to draw on and distill the results of several centuries of scholarly research into these questions. I also drew on my own investigations into some of the key themes of the poem, as in this book, in which I focus especially on the poem's hero Odysseus as a master of disguise. When Odysseus finally does get home, he finds his home occupied by enemies, would-be usurpers who have set themselves up in his house as suitors to his wife Penelope. He's only able to defeat them and recover his household and his former position there because he infiltrates his own house in disguise. This is related to the way in which he is a hero who stands out particularly for his cleverness, for his quick-wittedness and his self-control. And this makes him very different from other heroes, especially Achilles in the other great Homeric epic, the Iliad, who stand out for their physical strength and headlong commitment to combat. Odysseus is a more cerebral hero, and so one who particularly appeals to academics like me. But there are some kinds of knowledge that are vital for understanding a poem like the Odyssey that I, and most other people like me, simply do not have. I have no firsthand knowledge of what it is actually like to be a warrior, no idea of what it is really like to be away from home at war and then try to make your way back. And so I have learned a great deal from an initiative that has allowed me to share my scholarly expertise on Homer with people who do have that other kind of knowledge, namely contemporary veterans. And this has come about through a series of reading groups on the Odyssey and the other Homeric epic, the Iliad, organized under the auspices of an initiative called the Eternal Soldier, which Brian also mentioned in his presentation. Eternal Soldier is based here at Penn and brings together classicists, veterans, and people who work with veterans to make the ancient world's all too extensive record of warfare and of responses to warfare available to modern veterans, to provide a kind of distant mirror that might help them think about their own experiences. Veterans Read Homer has been one of our most successful projects. These are structured but low-pressure reading groups without the expectations of a class, and I'm always having to remind the people in class, in these reading groups, this isn't a course. It doesn't matter if they didn't do all the reading. It doesn't matter if they had to miss a class, because they take it very seriously. These are low-pressure reading groups in which we work through the poems. I use a condensed version so that the reading assignments are very manageable, no more than, say, 30 pages a week. The veterans in these groups have hundreds of questions for me, often more than my Penn students, but I have also, as I said, learned a great deal from them, and from their many comments about what rings true to them in these poems and what doesn't. And since our time is pretty short, I'll just give you a couple of examples of what I mean. As I mentioned, the Odyssey is partly a journey narrative, but a lot of it is devoted to how Odysseus overcomes the enemies who have occupied his home during his absence and triumphantly recovers what he had before he left: his house, his wife, his son, his slaves, etc. I'd always found that a very satisfying story, but I think I only really understood why it is so satisfying, really understood that fully and directly when I heard a veteran say, "When I was deployed, I was thinking about home all the time. And I was always thinking it would be exactly the way it was when I left. But when I got home, I found out that was a fantasy. That comment met with a lot of recognition from others in the group, who started talking about all the things that were disappointingly different when they got home, especially, of course, wives and lovers who had moved on. And that really shifted our discussion in a helpful way, from thinking about the Odyssey as a record of what it is like to return home from war, about which they had some skepticism, to thinking about the Odyssey as a fantasy, using that veteran's own term, about what that ought to be. Seeing Odysseus' ability to turn back the clock when he comes home as a fantasy helped these thoughtful readers to get beyond his dazzling heroism and see the struggling figure underneath. And this came through really powerfully for me in a discussion of this particular passage, in which the disguised Odysseus is interacting with his wife Penelope. So her lovely cheeks coursed with tears as she wept for her husband who was sitting before her. Odysseus pitied her tears in his heart, but his eyes were steady between their lids, as if they were made of horn or iron, and he concealed his own tears through guile. Here we see an extreme expression of Odysseus' special brand of heroism, his mastery of disguise, which allows him to mislead his own wife, even when she is in tears, because of how difficult it is to manage without him. But for me, it was really eye-opening to hear a veteran who's also a chaplain who works with other veterans say, he's emotionally numb. He just can't connect with her. For him, this passage, in which Odysseus ostensibly chooses not to connect with his wife for strategic reasons, resonated with the experience of many returning veterans who find it hard to reestablish a genuine emotional connection with their family members. And this opened up for me a new sense of the experiences of psychological paralysis and vulnerability that might lie behind a story like that of the Odyssey that glorifies the withholding and deception involved in disguise. So those are just a few of the productive insights that can come about when people with very different kinds of knowledge come together to talk about the ongoing legacy of the classical past. Thank you.
Questions for Professor Ornian? Yes.
So we call it PTSD now.
Uh-huh.
It used to be called shell shock. Is it each side of
Yeah, that's a question that a lot of scholars have investigated, and on which to which they have come to divided opinions. And I think that there are cases myself in which you do see a kind of response to trauma that does answer to our current notions of PTSD. I think that that's part of an ongoing debate, which is kind of like what Peter was talking about. You know, to what extent should we and shouldn't we use our own psychological categories, like a category like the unconscious, and what are the gains and losses, if you do, to talk about experience of a very distant world. But yes, my own view is that you really can see traces of what we would call PTSD in the ancient record.
But they didn't have a term for it.
They didn't have a single term for it. They didn't talk about it as a single phenomenon. Yeah, I mean, you're talking about a terminology that has emerged pretty recently, right? Shell shock in the context of World War I, PTSD more recently. Yeah. I can't think of a single term.
About guile. Last line.
Guile?
Yeah, he concealed his own tears through guile.
Guile, but see, guile there is being glorified. I mean, I think one of the most productive ways in which people have talked about Odysseus in relation to returning veterans is the way in which that guile might not be, you know, a master strategy so much as a kind of need, a protective cover that for someone who finds it pretty hard to sort of reestablish contact. Yeah.
Which is exactly what.
So
to some
that's,
extent.
well, I mean, so that would be one symptom that would be, I mean, I think that would be one way which you could say, here we see under a different name, one piece of what we call PTSD. And that might be more accurate and fruitful than saying we're going to find the exact same package of behaviors with a single name.
And of course, that's been translated, so I'd be curious to see what the Greek word was for it, if there's other interpretations
Yeah,
of that word.
yeah.
Is there anything in the ancient record of soldiers overwhelmed by war, putting down their weapons and refusing to fight?
Are there occasions of that
No, is there anything in the record?
in the record?
Well, I he saw.
Yeah.
As opposed to being overwhelmed by.
But overwhelmed by,
Something like PTSD or.
yeah.
There's a sorry.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
There's a moment when the Spartan fleet in the Aegean loses the Battle of Cnidus, I think it is 408, 406, and Mindarus, the Spartan general, is killed, and the rest of them don't know what to do. And they write a letter back to Sparta, which is intercepted along the way. The Athenians love this, and they read it out in the assembly, and it says, "The general is dead. We have no food. We don't know what to do."
Yeah.
Spartan laconic speech, but they seem to be just on the verge of giving up.
There are also some great mythological accounts of and Achilles would be an example of this, of warriors who feel mistreated by their commanders, who sometimes behave in a way we might almost call going berserk in response to that. Ajax, the figure that Brian showed you the picture of him about to commit suicide, would be one example of that. And in a system in which there was enormous emphasis on the honor of the warrior, if that honor was compromised, that could lead to extremely violent and psychologically intense results. Yeah.
The question that it's actually I have a similar question for Peter. And they both have to do with the sort of differences between today's world and the ancient world, because you both talked about similarities, but I think in both your talks there's cases where we kind of have the same experiences, but maybe we value them slightly differently. So in terms of the military experience, and I wonder if the ancient people maybe saw it as possibly more positive. Like now we might have the attitude that this is very honorable, but ideally you wouldn't have to fight, right? Whereas maybe the ancients thought, well, actually, you didn't have to fight. You might miss this honor, and a sort of related question. I'll just put this out there because I wanted to ask for Peter. Is this sort of thing in the ancient world? They're using their intuition, and it had a real valorization, right? Because this comes from the gods, so you can't ignore it, right? Whereas now we might use our intuition, but we sort of think, okay, I'm using this, but I don't have this. I don't give it the same value that I would have in actual a message from the gods. I don't. So I sort of see a similar. So I'll put that question to you. But
Yeah. Well, let's start with your question about sort of refusal of warfare or stepping away from warfare.
Yeah.
I mean, again, the Iliad, our very, very earliest text, is actually a very thoughtful and interesting response to that, in which Achilles, feeling he's been dishonored, does step away. And once he does, he starts asking questions like, why? And why would I do this? And is all the honor in the world really worth it if you're going to have a shorter life? But he asks all those questions, but he also forgets that he's emotionally connected to the other people involved in the war. And when his closest friend dies, he is moved to go back out of motives of revenge. And I think that what that's showing us is that, in fact, the Greeks already at the time of Homer had a very acute sense that, sure, and there are other moments when people fantasize that there might not be war. Just before he goes to meet Achilles, the Trojan hero, Hector says, what if I just went out there and put down my arms and we had a conversation? And then he thinks, no, there's no way that's going to work. There are these moments when people fantasize about getting away from war. But there is no sense that that would really be possible. And there's a sense that war is a constant feature of life that, much as you might dream of it, you would never be able to get away from. And that really also corresponds to the world that of the classical Greeks that Jeremy was talking about. They were at war all the time, and they never figured out a way not to be at war. And that leads to one of, I think, the most important distinctions I would make between our culture and theirs around the issue of the figure of the veteran. Because in ancient Greece, everyone was a veteran. There wasn't this sense of being a veteran as being part of a rather small and distinctive subset of the population that there is now. And that's one of the things, I think that's one reason why reading about the ancient Greeks is particularly appealing to modern veterans, because they're reading about a world in which people like them were more the norm, and rather than a very kind of distinct category.
And that just for my part, the question pertinent to my material, I absolutely I appreciate the question and the corrective to say, there's a certain thrill, I think, in recognizing similarities in these large, complex ways in which we understand the world. But that thrill should always be tempered by thorough scrutiny that looks for differences as well. Analogies are not identities, and I think that it's better, and your question helps push, it's better to think about this linkage between what we in the contemporary world call intuition and they in the ancient world called divination as an analogy. I make that claim in my axiom to claim that that is an identity. In other words, that there is a human cognitive capacity to know something without being able to explain how you know it. That I claim is the same. But the number of options that any particular culture at any time has for acculturating that, for describing it, fitting it into cultural paradigms, making it useful, controlling it, there are a wide array of ways in which a culture could decide to kind of process that. And I think in antiquity, their decision to process it through a voice coming from the gods, typically, right? My philosophers don't think that, but the common understanding of it at the time was that that's what it was, does shake out differently in different cultural contexts. Now, though, and that's very important to understand first, and what I'm about to say is it only is to nuance that, not to overturn it. There are still people today that will use gut instinct in a way that trumps, you'll forgive my word, rational thinking, right? They will say, all these rational thinkers and their science and their studies, my gut instinct is better than that. I think we should always be cautious when people do such a thing, right? And I think also in antiquity, the detailed cultural form that divination represented had built into it lots of very careful controls over these claims toward knowledge based on this other, what I would say, mode of thinking, according to my axiom, what they would say, claims toward knowledge based on being able to hear what the divine is saying. So yes, differences, and analogy is the better way of thinking about it than identity. So,
I
yes.
have not really a question, but a comment, an analogy with things I attended earlier on the other side of the campus. And I'm going to make an analogy between machine learning and divination. There are two things which struck me. One is the entrails and the shapes of things. And this is something that comes up in the data analysis. You get what might be seen as a spurious correlation.
Yeah.
I can give like two random examples. Consumption of margarine and divorce rates can be correlated. Or Nicolas Cage movies and swimming pool deaths. And that is something that, if you think about it, is like entrails. And the other example I can give, which a classical example, is famous classical example, the die is cast. And sometimes in these algorithms, the best thing to do actually is to choose a random number. Just a comment.
I find that very provocative. I wish I was at the earlier session. I was teaching a class, but I would go at it another way, I think, in addition, not in replacing the way that you, to link in, that we are not yet graduated from reliance on our intuitive thinking. And in fact, I think that only certain dogmatists among us would claim that we should be. That there's our processes of creative ability to find patterns in data for whom there are multiple potentially pertinent patterns it's a little different than our ability to draw an inference. And people wiser than I, and including those, I'm assuming who you just heard from, are picking apart and trying to get a better grip on all these ways in which our rationality functions, not just according to that sort of the standard paradigm that I kind of laid out, but all the ways in which it functions that produce useful results for us. And I'm actually going to teach a course in the fall with an engineer who specifically studies this material, Danielle Bassett, from her perspective. And I'm going to do it from the material that I find in antiquity, and we're going to see the different ways in which these kinds of things are construed. The fascinating thing for me, among the many takeaways, always the most fascinating one is just how wondrous our ability to know is, and how much it resists neat, tidy formulations.
Keeping your warning, that analogies and identities firmly in mind, but there is a connection between the auguries of the future we found in the divinations of the past and the way the machine learning algorithms are mining the data for auguries of the future today, making predictive algorithms. The analogy actually goes deeper in terms of the subconscious, because the most powerful machine learning algorithms today use these things called deep learning, modeled after neural networks. They're artificial neural networks, but nonetheless, they're called neural networks. And they're called deep learning because they're construed in so many layers that when they do produce a prediction, they're trying to be extraordinarily accurate. For example, even with the fatality in driverless cars from yesterday, even with that in mind, they produce extraordinarily accurate results. But we can't interpret how and why. In fact, there's an arm of DARPA, which is now they're thinking about using such deep learning networks to try to interpret what other deep learning networks are doing. Which then begs the question, because then who quis custodiet ipsos custodis, right?
If they call it Skynet, we're all doomed.
But I think the analogy goes much deeper. It connects in strange and wondrous ways as well.
Yes.
You uttered the word Trump earlier.
I did.
When
as a verb.
As a non-classicist, think of the classical world sort of in relationship to our country right now. I guess I see a ruler probably out of control to some degree. I see public discourse sort of in ruins and so forth. And I guess I just wonder if any of you sort of have comments about that sort of situation in relationship to, I don't know, Roman history, or it just seems like to me that there are resonances there that could maybe be a little hopeful for us or something. I don't know.
Jeremy.
I think the level of political discourse is fantastic. I've never known so many people to be riveted by the news each day.
I guess I'm thinking of language, the use of language, and a breakdown of sort of meaning, perhaps. But
yeah, well, there's an element of the emperor's new clothes. The New Yorker cover today has demonstrated. If any of you have seen that, I think predictions about the end of the world are premature. Personally. And this has got nothing to do with the ancient world, it's to do with the vigor of the institutions of political life in this country. And I think okay, I'll speak personally here as someone from the liberal side of things, and someone who does not regard liberal as a dirty word, as some people in this country do. What for me has been very encouraging is a greater awareness that being inside my own echo chamber of reading the news organizations that appeal to my way of living has been revealed to be an utterly inadequate way of engaging with the world. That there are large swathes of this country and strata within the complex melange that makes up the US that we need to be engaging with far more vigorously, and I find that an exciting challenge. So, this too shall pass.
Yeah, I think, Jeremy, of your earlier comments about it's important not to look back at antiquity and say everything was perfect then.
Absolutely.
But and in that sense, I mean, the human race has survived so far. There is some hope. I was thinking actually when this conversation came up, when this line came up about words have changed their meaning, I was thinking about Thucydides talking about a moment of tremendous political stress. When words began to be used in unfamiliar ways. Sounded a lot like what you were saying.
I would also just add to that, Plato's Republic. I'm reading that with a group of freshmen right now. It's extraordinary, and its pertinence changes from year to year as I reread it, and decade to decade. But the pertinence in the contemporary situation is, to me, extraordinary. You want to read particularly what happens in Book 8 and 9, when Plato, it says in his claim that democracy inevitably leads to tyranny, and see where you think we are on that analogy. I'm not presenting it as a roadmap to the contemporary world at all to the students. I'm presenting it as a set of extraordinarily thoughtful observations that can be pushed and pulled against, and let's see where they're going to go with it. But it is unbelievably provocative for the contemporary world. I would recommend Plato's Republic.
So Plato 8 and 9, but my question was, which of your books would you recommend to start with if you wanted to?
My own? Well, I suppose the divination book, if in reference to this, divination and human nature, would be the one. And if you need to make a bulk order, they make great gifts.
Award-winning books would you recommend?
I believe there's a hand up in the back. Yes.
Yeah. So what's the difference between intuition and a swag?
What's a swag?
Silly wild ass guess.
It's a matter of nomenclature, isn't it?
Yeah, right. It's a matter of nomenclature. I think that important to bring up, and anyone that makes a claim based on an intuition is likely to run into the objection that what you've got instead is a swag. So I think that there are such things as swags, but I also think that that doesn't mean that there aren't such things sometimes in some contexts as intuitions. In other words, that have a better claim to knowledge than something completely unfounded. So yeah, I think that there is such a thing as a claim to knowledge that doesn't answer to that paradigm one of knowledge production that I talked about.
So when you set up that spectrum,
yeah,
where you had rational thought,
yeah,
and on the other end you had religion,
belief, yeah.
Okay. Where would swag?
Closer to belief for these philosophers. Plato in particular has a very structured way of thinking about where knowledge comes from. Belief is at the very low end, but even farther than that, that would be total ignorance. Total ignorance.
So one could argue that at least a portion of intuition should be further down the chart.
Yeah, and I think it's reasonable to do so. I'm trying to present what these Greek philosophers made of it, and they thought something was there, and they approached it in the way are analogous to our contemporary cognitive scientists approaching what a layman again would call intuition. I think that the Gladwell book is a nice proof of concept that there's something happening on the research side of our cognitive in the cognitive scientists, that there is some need to widen our sense of the modes by which we gain useful knowledge. and then following up the studies, which present some differences from the way they're presented in Gladwell. But following up the studies is further proof. I think that there are things happening in our minds that don't answer to that paradigm one of the way knowledge comes. But I'd also, they're obviously very cautious, and I'd want to be equally cautious for my own reasons to say that doesn't mean anything goes, and that we trust the person that says, my gut says, your facts say X, but my gut says Y, and my gut is always right. That, and none of the philosophers I study would be in a position to embrace, gut saying Y when facts say X. Never. And in fact, their work, it does a lot of work to try to hem in, particularly a situation exactly like that.
Maybe get put on his head.
One hopes not. Yes.
Understanding that Shakespeare is not one of the ancient philosophers.
Yeah.
The play The Winter's Tale has like all of these things in it at once. And just a little bit so. There's a guy who just thinks he's right. And then they send off to the oracle at Delphi to find out what the real answer is. So all this stuff is persistent. So it's sort of like, connecting a lot of the ancient thought to some of the things now. Well, that's guesses and certainty, thinking you're certain because it's your gut feeling when you don't really have a good reason. All that stuff is present there. So can you say anything about the trajectory, like the history, the trajectory of divination through that time to now?
I have thoughts on it, but not something that I'd say I'm an authority. But in working through the material in the book, my axiom, if it is an axiom, should be true in all times, and that surplus knowledge, the stuff that arrives to you and you can't explain where you got it, will provoke different kinds of cultural formations over time. And I do think that there's that there are traces that a person that was spent more time than I did on this question could come up with a sensible history of how people have approached this. So I would only underline to say I think such a thing could be written. I could point to just a few kind of points along the way. Closer to Shakespeare's time, Milton has this wonderful conversation between angels about how angels think intuitively, which is all at once and in a rush. They don't need to do discursive reason, so draw conclusions using inference. They just know. And that, I think, it belongs to this, somehow belongs to this history. The term intuition itself enters English through a Latin coinage in the Middle Ages. It is a term devised in order to describe how angels think. It happens in medieval scholasticism to say that this is precisely what angels do. It has a later history in European philosophy that has quite different resonance, draws from Aristotle and others. It's a very complex ongoing. So, but I don't think that a history of this has been written, and I don't think that we're close quite to having one be able to be written. There's a lot more work that needs to be done in the individual time periods and before a long arc could be made. But I think such a thing could be done at some point. Yeah, and my axiom already has a claim that it's somehow the same phenomena that's trying to be explained. Yeah.
Doesn't the intuition model that you're speaking of presuppose an essentially healthy mind to begin with?
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if in ancient medical texts there aren't studies of unhealthy minds that follow intuition to disastrous ends or voices that they hear that might inform what you're doing.
I'm trying to think it's interesting because the healthy mind question, there's definitely a different mind that the good diviner is thought to have. So, for example, the figure that is the oracle that sits at Delphi, the Pythia, was thought to be thoroughly uneducated. It was also, for the Greek men that were constructing this cultural form, they placed a woman in that position, which for them made perfect sense because in their own understanding, women's rationality was not so thoroughly present. So it was not intruding in the other mode of thinking that allowed them to draw the kinds of conclusions that they did using this other mode of thinking. So it's a different kind of rationality that they claim these other folks have. Now, healthy and unhealthy, so voices that just sort of arrive to a person based on an impairment due to disease that we would call a psychological disease, a mental disease. I need to see if colleagues have ideas on that, because it's not so. Yeah, people do run stark raving mad and lose their minds, but it's usually because of some trauma that intrudes on their rational power at some point. Not that they sort of stay psychologically unhealthy. But I wonder if.
Yeah, I was trying to think of mythological examples of madness and so forth, but there often that's sent by gods and is actually giving, I mean, it may be painful and disruptive, but giving access actually to true knowledge.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's certainly a question, I mean, I think around this question of, what we would call suspicious, suspect knowledge is also the idea that what we think of as madness may be actually quite true, or leading to truth, to insight.
Well, I think we should respect the clock, and thank you all for coming and exploring the possibilities.